Lucifer walked along the cobblestone path, his small shoe pressing against the uneven stone warmed by the afternoon sun beside him. The aged man moved with quiet dignity, gray-haired, blue-eyed, clad in the crimson and black of the Fire Nation's military. The gold embroidery on his robes gleamed subtly, marking his rank, though he carried himself without arrogance. The air smelled of burning incense drifting from a distant shrine, mixed with the crisp scent of pond water and the faint, earthy aroma of freshly trimmed bonsai trees. A warm breeze rustled through the willow branches, making the long leaves sway like delicate fingers grazing the water's surface. The distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed through the courtyard, punctuated by the rhythmic march of soldiers training beyond the stone walls. Occasionally, a bird chirped, a fleeting, fragile sound against the structured discipline of the Fire Nation stronghold. Lucifer's sharp eyes took in the architecture, curved rooftops with golden edges, towering pagodas casting long shadows, and the intricate woodwork of the gazebos that dotted the landscape. Despite the beauty, the air felt heavy, thick with expectation, as if the very walls watched him. There was power here, silent, patient, and absolute. The feeling clawed at him, a reminder of where he was. A land where power dictated one's worth. He exhaled softly, the weight of his past life pressing against the present. He was just a child in their eyes, but he knew better. Then, a hushed giggle broke the stillness. Lucifer's sharp eyes flickered to the side, catching sight of two figures crouched behind a bush. The first had sharp, golden eyes, her expression brimming with amusement, as if she was on the verge of doing something entertaining at someone else's expense. The other, a girl with warm brown eyes and an airy demeanor, leaned in excitedly, her hands pressed together in anticipation. His gaze followed theirs. A little ahead, by a small flower garden, stood another pair. A dark-haired boy, tall for his age, was gesturing toward the flowers with an almost serious expression. He pointed at the delicate petals of a lily, then an orchid, explaining something as if it mattered. The girl beside him barely seemed to hear him. She had dark hair, sharp but unreadable eyes, and an air of quiet detachment. Except for the way she looked at him. Her gaze lingered, soft and intent, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. Infatuation. The thought came easily. The golden-eyed girl, the one hiding behind the bush moments ago, had stepped forward now, approaching the dark-haired boy and the quiet girl near the flowers. "Do you two want to play a game?" The dark-haired boy turned sharply, eyes narrowing. He hadn't expected her, that much was clear. His suspicion was immediate, his body tensing, as if preparing for whatever trick was surely coming. "What kind of game?" he asked, warily. The quiet girl beside him said nothing. She simply watched, her gaze lingering on the golden-eyed one. She wasn't surprised, nor was she particularly interested, just observing. The golden-eyed girl, who had interrupted the peaceful moment by the flowers, leaned toward the bubbly brown-eyed one and whispered something. A grin stretched across the latter's face before she launched into a series of fluid movements, a backflip, a twist, and a cartwheel, before vanishing from the garden entirely. The dark-haired boy sighed, his suspicion evident, and he knew her well enough to be wary. "What are you up to?" he asked, arms crossed. "Why would I even be part of this?" The girl smiled, tilting her head slightly. "Brother-sister bonding. Isn't that how siblings are?" Lucifer's steps slowed. Interesting. There was a smoothness to her tone, a carefully chosen sweetness masking something else beneath it. The dark-haired boy hesitated, his lips pressing together. He was uncertain, but something else weighed on him. Regret. No, obligation. His eyes lowered slightly, lost in thought. Then he sighed again. "Fine." Lucifer glanced up at Ray, his father, who was intrigued by sight and noticed the questioning look in his son's eyes. The expression seemed to say, "Who the hell are they, and why are they in the palace garden?" Ray smirked, amused by Lucifer's silent question. "Mai, Zuko, Azula, and Tai Li," he introduced, gesturing toward the children. "They come from noble families. You'll be seeing more of them. Tai Li, the one who already left moments ago, comes from a noble family of the Fire Nation. She is one of 7 identical sisters, yet she carries an energy that sets her apart from them all. Mai," he continued, nodding toward the girl standing with her arms crossed, an apple balanced on her head, "is the only child of Governor Akano and his wife, Michi. Prince Zuko, the only boy among them, stands as the eldest of the group and the crown prince of the Fire Nation. And Princess Azula," Ray finished, his voice laced with knowing, with her black hair tied in the same ponytail as her brother, "is the youngest child of Ursa and Fire Lord Ozai. A prodigy, one whose talent is matched only by her ambition." Ray glanced down at Lucifer again, his smirk deepening. They're here for a reason. You'll figure it out soon enough. Then, the brown-eyed girl returned, hands springing into a cartwheel before landing gracefully in front of her friend, an apple in her palm. Azula plucked the apple from her hands, smiling as if she had already won before the game had even begun. Now, she said, spinning the apple in her grasp, let me explain how this game works. Lucifer watched silently, his mind already working through the possibilities. This should be amusing. Lucifer's eyes remained locked on the golden-eyed girl as she twirled the apple in her palm, her smirk widening with each passing second. What you do, she finally said, is try to knock the apple off the other person's head. The moment she spoke, her gaze shifted toward the Mai, the one who had been watching quietly all this time. Lucifer noted the pause. She wasn't asking, she was expecting. Mai sighed, expression unreadable, before stepping forward without complaint. She positioned herself under the shade of a curved pavilion, her posture perfectly still as she placed the apple atop her head. Lucifer narrowed his eyes. She's used to this. A touch on the dark-haired boy's shoulder drew his attention. Ty Lee, smiling as if this were all harmless fun, gripped his arm and easily maneuvered him backward, 5 steps away from the waiting target. Lucifer observed the subtle way the boy tensed at being handled so casually. His discomfort wasn't in the game itself, but in the way it was all unfolding around him, out of his control. Azula, unfazed, took 6 steps back herself, positioning herself at a greater distance than the Zuko, a deliberate choice. Azula lifted her hand, preparing for the demonstration. Then, Azula raised her hand. Like this. Her fingertips ignited, fire bending to her will as she released a thin, precise stream of flame. The fire licked at the apple, setting it alight without even touching the dark-haired girl's hair. Zuko, however, reacted instantly. His body tensed as he saw the fire spread over the apple, panic flashing across his face. Without thinking, he lunged forward, reaching out to grab the burning fruit before the flames could spread. Just as he moves, Ty Lee casually steps forward, her foot sliding to his path. Zuko's foot caught on hers. His balance vanished in an instant. Zuko crashed into Mai, tackling her straight to the ground. A thud echoed through the garden. The apple, still flickering with embers, rolled onto the cobblestone path. The girl, so unreadable before, suddenly turned bright red, her cheeks burning hotter than the flames that had just been on the apple. Lucifer tilted his head. Zuko, still tangled with her, looked too angry to even notice her embarrassment. His fists clenched at his sides as he pushed himself up, scowling, frustration written all over his face. A soft chuckle broke the silence. Lucifer's gaze flicked to the Azula, who watched the scene with clear amusement, her smirk widening. She planned this. Lucifer sighed. He had merely been taking a walk, but now. This was far more interesting than he expected. Azula's smirk faltered for just a moment as she caught the sound of a quiet chuckle. It wasn't Ty Lee's usual giggle, nor was it Zuko's frustrated grumbling. No, this was something different, something unfamiliar. Her sharp golden eyes flicked to the source. Standing a short distance away on the cobblestone path was a boy around her age. He had deep red hair, strikingly vivid against the backdrop of the Fire Nation's traditional black and gold. But what stood out the most were his eyes, cool, piercing blue, a color rarely seen among their people. Beside him stood a tall man, presumably his father. The man's hair was silvered with age, though his sharp blue eyes held a watchful awareness. His Fire Nation armor, though standard in design, was worn with a quiet dignity that suggested experience. Azula's gaze lingered on the boy. Ty Lee, ever perceptive, followed Azula's gaze and gasped softly. "Ooh, who's that?" she whispered excitedly. Zuko, still fuming from the humiliating scene moments ago, looked over as well. His scowl deepened when he noticed the newcomer watching them. Mai, meanwhile, barely reacted. She only cast a glance at the boy before returning her eyes to the ground, likely wishing to disappear after what just happened. Lucifer said nothing. He merely met Azula's gaze with a quiet, unreadable expression. And for the first time in a long while, Azula felt as if she were the one being studied. Her lips curled into a smirk. Interesting. Ty Lee, still fascinated, giggled beside her. "He's pretty, don't you think?" she whispered, eyes sparkling with curiosity. Azula rolled her eyes. "He's weird." Zuko, still recovering from his earlier humiliation, crossed his arms and huffed. "He looks bored." His glare deepened, clearly annoyed by the boy's detached expression. Brimming with excitement, Ty Lee approached Lucifer, effortlessly flipping through the air before landing gracefully in front of him. The boy watched her with an unreadable expression, seemingly unaffected by her lively display. Beside him, his father let out a quiet chuckle of amusement. With a bright smile and eyes alight with curiosity, Ty Lee greeted him cheerfully. "Hey there. I'm Ty Lee. What's your name?" Lucifer stared at her, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. He had seen her type before, bubbly, energetic, always moving. The kind of person who acted on impulse rather than careful thought. For a moment, he considered ignoring her, but that would only make her more persistent. Instead, he chose to respond in a measured tone. Lucifer, Ray, standing beside him, chuckled. "No need to be so stiff, kid. She just wants to talk." Ty Lee clasped her hands together, grinning. "Ooh, that's such a cool name. You don't talk much, huh? That makes you mysterious." She leaned in slightly, examining his expression as if trying to read his thoughts. Lucifer's gaze remained steady. "Or maybe I just don't waste words." Ty Lee blinked before giggling. "Wow, you're like the total opposite of me." She did a playful spin. "So, what do you like to do for fun? Do you like acrobatics, fighting, or maybe reading?" Lucifer tilted his head slightly. "I read." Ty Lee gasped dramatically. "I knew it. You totally have that I sit in a dark room reading ancient scrolls vibe. What do you read about?" Lucifer considered his answer carefully. He could brush her off, but she was too persistent. If he shut her down completely, she'd only become more curious. Instead, he chose to redirect. "Any book that I can get my hands on," Ty Lee hummed thoughtfully, tapping her chin. So you're like a super smart, serious guy. I bet you're really good at planning stuff, huh?" Ray smirked, watching the interaction with amusement. "All right, son," he said, patting Lucifer on the back. "I have business to attend to." With that, he turned away, his boots clicking against the cobblestone floor as he strode toward the palace. "Really? Are you kidding me? You want me to babysit these children?" Lucifer sighed, folding his arms as his gaze settled on Ty Lee. She was loud, overly cheerful, and far too open with her emotions. She reminded him of someone, Naruto. That same boundless energy, as if the world couldn't break her spirit no matter what. Always smiling, always positive. And yet, she was also useful. Someone like her could be easily underestimated, yet she had skills, acrobatics, agility, and perhaps even combat potential. But he knew something deeper about people like her. Those who shined the brightest often carried the heaviest burdens. Their joy wasn't always effortless. It was a choice, a shield, a way to keep the weight of their struggles hidden. Azula, watching from nearby, scoffed. "Is that supposed to be impressive?" she said, arms crossed. "Reading a few books and parroting information back isn't exactly an achievement. Anyone with half a brain can do that." Lucifer barely spared her a glance. If she thought belittling him would get a reaction, she was mistaken. He had lived through worse. Petty insults were nothing compared to what he had endured before. Still, he noted the way she spoke, the way she dismissed his efforts so easily. It wasn't just arrogance. It was gaining control. If she allowed others to be praised, it diminished her own standing. That was her game. Interesting. Rather than responding, he simply smirked, letting the silence do the work for him. If there was one thing people like Azula hated, it was being ignored. Azula wasn't done. Her golden eyes gleamed with amusement as she tilted her head. "And look at you," she mused. "So, detached from dear father. Not like me and mine. It must be strange, isn't it? Being part of a family but never really belonging to it." Azula smirked, sensing the irritation beneath his silence. Lucifer exhaled slowly, forcing his emotions back into a cold, controlled mask. He turned to her, smirking just enough to mirror her own condescension. "Strange? Not really. I've just never been desperate for approval. Family, why did she call my family? Did she know more that I knew myself that Ray is a powerful firebender and is still quite a lower rank than others? Is there something I don't know about? Oh, is that what you tell yourself? It must be exhausting pretending not to care." Her hands are back with a smirk. Azula is the type of person who would use subtle methods to influence someone since she believes that losing is a sin and should not be tolerated. He understands the power of words and influence, and he wouldn't let her dictate the flow of the conversation. "And yet, here you are, trying so hard to make me care. You wouldn't waste your breath if you weren't desperate for control." Ty Lee, who is in the center of the back in front of the two people, is unsure what to do. Zuko is astounded by how effortlessly this random kid can counteract Azula's brainwashing, while Mai remains interested in the encounter. Tell me, princess, are you the one who's desperate? Is someone in your life absent? Lucifer had heard countless whispers in the palace, maids gossiping about how much of a monster that bitch Azula was. Seeing it firsthand, he could understand why. She was a young girl who had grown up with immense privilege, but it came at a cost. Perfection was not a choice, it was a demand. From birth, she had been in constant competition. According to the maids, she was supposedly better than the firstborn prince, a failure in her eyes. What a prodigy. Hey guys, cut it, we don't want to make enemies of each other. Ty Lee stopped the potential fight from happening. She knows how much fire Azula can breathe. Stopping them being in the center of between them, even though Azula is a few feet away, Ty Lee felt Azula would explode any moment. Hey, guys, cut it out. We don't want to make enemies of each other. Ty Lee stepped in, stopping the fight before it could begin. She knew just how much fire Azula could breathe. Even though Azula stood a few feet away, it felt as if she could explode at any moment. What, Ty Lee? We were just having a conversation. Isn't that right, downcast? Lucifer exhaled softly. He had no interest in entertaining the ego of a spoiled princess, nor did he care for whatever petty game she wanted to play. Engaging further would be a waste of time. Azula thrived on conflict, and he had no intention of feeding into it. His dark eyes flickered to Ty Lee, who was tense, her usual cheerfulness nowhere to be seen. Even Zuko looked ready for things to escalate, while Mai simply observed with veiled interest. Of course, just a conversation. Ty Lee relaxed, just a little, but she still felt like she was standing between two dragons ready to strike at any moment. Zuko, still wary, narrowed his eyes. Who the hell is this kid? Mai, on the other hand, found herself more intrigued than before. Lucifer wasn't like the people they usually dealt with. He was different, and it was always worth watching. So that was basically what happened. Ray infiltrated Ba Sing Se, but in the end, we lost. Lord Iroh lost his confidence and surrendered, making it a complete defeat for the Fire Nation, even though we managed to breach the outer walls. What a pain. At the very least, I'm no longer trapped in the pathetic state of being a baby. At least now, I can move. Hey there, Lucifer, a sweet, familiar voice reached my ears. Immediately, I felt it, the presence of the devil lurking right next to me, waiting for its loyal slave to wake up. Now, as a slave, how do I escape this situation? Lucifer had a solution. Pretend not to hear anything. I am naming it the pretend sleep strategy. This strategy will solve my predicament flawlessly. If the person speaking were a kind girl, she would simply sigh and say, well, it can't be helped. I'll forgive you because I'm nice. What kind of lunatic would actually say that? If you don't wake up in 3 seconds, I will poke you. Lucifer tensed, burying his face deeper into his arms. Don't do it, Ty Lee. His voice was muffled by his hands as he lay face down, blocking out the world. Less than a second later, pretend sleep strategy foiled. He had succumbed to the threat. Still, he refused to lift his head. He would resist until the bitter end. Look, just as I expected, you were awake. Can you give me 20 minutes? Lucifer mumbled. Don't make me poke you. I hate this. Why is my precious time being ruined by a kid? This is what I get for staying out so late. Lucifer was naturally more active at night, training under the cover of darkness, away from distractions. That was his time to focus, to be alone with himself. Poke. Ah. Not again. A barrage of strikes rained down on his sides, each one sharper and more precise. If he didn't stop this now, his chakra pathways would be paralyzed, and he'd be forcibly carried away by Ty Lee. Unacceptable.